So, Chapter 2 of Grandpa's Great Escape by David Walliams. 2. Slippers. Over time, Grandpa's mind began transporting him back to the days of glory more and more. By the time our story begins, the old man completely believed that it was still World War II, even though the war had ended decades before. Grandpa had become very confused, a condition that affects some elderly people. It was serious, and sadly, there was no cure. Instead, it seemed likely it would worsen over time, until one day Grandpa might not be able to remember his own name. But, as ever in life, when there is tragedy, you can often find comedy. In recent times, the old man's condition had led to some very funny moments. On bonfire night, Grandpa insisted everyone go down to the air raid shelter at once when the next door neighbours started letting off fireworks in the garden. Or there was the time when Grandpa cut a wafer-thin chocolate mint into 4 pieces with a penknife and shared it out with his family because of rationing. Most memorable of all was the time Grandpa decided that the shopping trolley at the supermarket was a Lancaster bomber. He hurtled down the aisles on a top-secret mission, hurling huge bags of flour. These bombs exploded everywhere, over the food, over the tills, even covering the supermarket manageress from head to toe. She looked like a powdery ghost. The clean-up operation lasted many weeks, and Grandpa was banned from the supermarket. Sometimes Grandpa's confusion could be more upsetting. Jack had never met his grandmother. This is because she had died, sadly, nearly 40 years ago. It had been one night towards the end of the war in a Nazi bombing raid over London. At the time, Jack's father was a newborn baby. However, when Jack stayed at his grandfather's tiny flat, the old man would sometimes call for his darling Peggy as if she was in the next room. Tears would well in the boy's eye. It was heartbreaking. Despite everything, Grandpa was an incredibly proud man, and everything had to be just so. He was always impeccably dressed in a uniform of a double-breasted blazer, crisp white shirt and neatly pressed grey slacks. A maroon, silver and blue striped Royal Air Force tie was knotted neatly around his neck. As was the fashion in many World War II pilots, he favoured a dashing flying ace's moustache. It was a thing of wonder. The moustache was long and it was connected to his sideburns. It was like a beard, but it had the chin bit missing. Grandpa would twizzle the ends of his moustache for hours until they stuck out at right angles. The one thing that would give Grandpa's confused state of mind away was his choice of footwear. Slippers. The old man no longer wore shoes. Now, he always forgot to put them on, whatever the weather. In rain, sleet, snow, he would be sporting his brown check slippers. Of course, Grandpa's eccentric behaviour made the grown-ups worry. Sometimes Jack would pretend to go to bed, but instead creep out of his bedroom and sit at the top of his stairs in his pyjamas. There he would listen to his mother and father in the kitchen downstairs discussing Grandpa. Picture of his granddad looking very smart. They would use big words that Jack didn't understand to describe the man's condition. Then, Mum and Dad would argue about Grandpa being in the old folks' home. The boy hated hearing his grandfather talked about in this way, as if he was some sort of a problem. However, being only 12 years old, Jack felt powerless to do anything. But none of that stopped Jack adoring hearing his stories about the old man's wartime adventures, even though these tales had become quite so real to Grandpa. Now that the pair would act them out, they were the boy's own adventure stories and a daring duo. Grandpa had an ancient wooden record player the size of a bath. On it he would play booming orchestral music with volumes as high as it could go. Military bands were his favourite, and together Jack and his grandfather would listen to huge classical pieces like Rule Britannia, Land of Hope and Glory or Pomp and Circumstance. 2 old armchairs would become their cockpits. As the music soared, so did they in their imaginary fighter planes. A Spitfire for Grandpa and a Hurricane for Jack. Up, up, up and away they would go. Together they would fly high above the clouds, outwitting enemy aircraft. Every Sunday night, the pair of flying aces would win the Battle of Britain without even leaving the old man's tiny flat. Together, Grandpa and Jack inhabited their own world and had countless imaginary adventures. However, the night our story starts, a real-life adventure was about to begin. Oh, do you want chapter 3 as well? I think we can do chapter 3. 3. A waft of cheese. This particular evening, Jack was asleep in his bedroom, dreaming he was a World War II pilot, as he did every night. He was sitting behind the controls of his Hurricane, taking on a squadron of deadly Messerschmitts, when he heard a distant sound of the telephone ring. Ring, 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 ring. That's strange, he thought. There weren't any telephones on board 1940 fighter planes. Yet the telephone still kept ringing. Ring, 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 ring. The boy woke up with a start. As he sat up in bed, he banged his head on his model Lancaster bomber that was suspended from the ceiling. Ow! He cried. He checked the time on the nickel-plated RAF pilot watch his grandfather had given him. 2:30 a.m. Who on earth was calling the house at this hour? The boy leapt down from his top bunk and opened his bedroom door. Downstairs, in the hall, he could hear his mother talking on the telephone. No, he hasn't turned up here, she said. After a few moments, Mum spoke again. Her familiar tone convinced Jack that she must be talking to his father. Still no sign of the old man at all? Well, what are you going to do, Barry? I don't know, he's your father, but you can't stay out at night looking for him. Jack couldn't remain silent for a moment longer. From the top of the stairs he cried, What's happened to Grandpa? Mum looked up. Oh, well done, Barry, now Jack's woken up. She put her hand over the receiver. Go back to bed this instant, young man. You've got school in the morning. I don't care, said the boy with defiance. What's happened to Grandpa? Mum returned to the telephone call. Barry, call you back in 2 minutes. It's all going off here now, and all that. And she slammed down the receiver. What's happened? Demanded the boy again, as he ran downstairs to join his mother. Mum sighed theatrically, as if all the whales in the world were on her shoulder. She did that a lot. It was at that moment that Jack realised he could smell cheese. But not normal cheese. Smelly cheese, blue cheese, runny cheese, mouldy cheese, cheesy cheese. His mother worked at the cheese counter at the local supermarket, and wherever she went, a strong waft of cheese came with her. Both stood in the hall in their nightclothes, Jack in his striped blue pyjamas, his mother in her pink fluffy nightgown. Her hair was in curlers and she had thick smears of face cream on her cheeks, forehead and nose. She often left it on at night. Jack wasn't exactly sure why. Mum thought herself as quite a beauty and often claimed to be the glamorous face of the cheese, if ever such a thing was possible. Mum flicked on the light and they both blinked for a moment at the sudden brightness. Your grandpa's gone missing again. Oh no! Oh yes, the woman sighed once more. It was clear she was worn out by the old man. Sometimes she would even roll her eyes at Grandpa's war stories as if she was bored. This bothered Jack greatly. Grandpa's stories were infinitely more interesting than being told about this week's best-selling cheese. Me and your father were woken up by a phone call around midnight. From who? His neighbour downstairs, you know, that newsagent man. After his big house had become too much for him, Grandpa had moved last year into a little flat above the shop. Not just any shop, a newsagent shop. Not just any newsagent shop, Raj's. Raj? Replied Jack now. Yeah, that's his name, Raj, and he thought he might have heard your old grandpa's door banging around midnight. He knocked on his door, but there was no answer. The poor man got himself into a terrible panic, so he called here. Where's Dad? He jumped in the car and has been out searching for your grandpa for the past couple of hours. Couple of hours? The boy couldn't believe what he was hearing. Why didn't you wake me? Mum sighed again. Tonight was your turn into a sciathon. Me and your dad know how fond you are of him, so we didn't want you to worry, did we? Well, I am worried, replied the boys. In truth, he felt a lot closer to his exciting grandfather than he did anyone else in his family, including his mum and dad. Time spent with his grandpa was always precious. We're all worried, replied Mum. I am really worried. Well, we're all really worried. Well, I am really, really worried. Well, we're all really, really worried. Now next I have a competition about who is the most worried, she started shouting angrily. Jack could tell his mother was becoming increasingly stressed, so thought best not to reply with the last remark, even though he was really, really, really worried. I've told your dad 100 times your grandpa needs to go into an old folks' home. Never, said the boy. He knew the old man better than anyone. Grandpa would absolutely hate that. Grandpa, or Wing Commander Bunting, as he was known during the war, was far too proud to spend the last of his days with a lot of old dears doing crosswords and knitting. Mum shook her head. Jack, you're just too young to understand. Like all children, Jack hated being told this, but now wasn't the time to argue. Mum, please, let's go and look for him. Are you nuts? It's freezing outside, said the woman. We have to do something. Grandpa is out there, somewhere, lost. Ring, 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 ring. Jack lunged to the telephone, lifting the receiver before his mum could. Dad, where are you? The town square? Mum said we should come and help you look for Grandpa. He lied, and his mother gave him an angry look. We'll be there as soon as we can. The boy put the receiver down and took his mum by the hand. Grandpa needs us, he said. Jack opened the door, and the pair ran out into the darkness. And we'll read chapter 4 tomorrow to see how Grandpa's great escape develops.